My name is Faisal Ahmed. I am a senior in the BA/MA program studying economics, and I have a minor in applied human development, but that's not really relevant to this academic exercise. I really like studying economics, and so this was really an exploration of trying to use everything I've learned over the course of my academic coursework to try and apply it into what was inspired by a graduate class I took on international economics. So I'm calling it Adjusting Gravity, and that title will make a lot more sense as we go through the paper. But first, I just wanted to talk really briefly about why to study international trade more broadly. I mean, first, it's a really big number. It amounts to a large amount of economic activity. So understanding even really small percentages of what makes up international trade can lead to really big consequences for people. Second, it's a vital pathway to increase globalization-related topics. And to speak personally, I've grown up I've had a pretty international upbringing, being born in Doha, Qatar, living in Saudi Arabia, immigrating to the United States. So anything international related just really makes me interested in it. And I also think it's the way that the world is generally headed towards a pathway with more migration and cooperation between countries and parties. And so understanding this kind of economic activity really contributes to that as well. And then finally, international trade determinants and its strategies greatly affect domestic factors. For example, the wages of workers in a country, the other GDP compositions, and things that I will mention later on. So I think it might be helpful to understand a little bit also as to how economists study trade. Essentially, economists do this cycle of creating theory and then doing an empirical analysis using a lot of mathematical tools that they develop, and then they jump back and forth between doing this stuff. So I'm going to introduce a pretty brief theory. It's a Ricardian model of international trade, and we're going to try to make it as fun as I can, because I know sometimes studying economic theory is not the most fun thing you can be doing on your Saturday afternoon. So we're going to say there's two countries. There's Italy and Japan, and there's two products that make up all the economic activity in these countries. So in Italy, all they do is make shoes or car parts, and in Japan, all they do is make shoes and car parts. And something we're going to introduce is a little bit of skill bias. Sylvester Stallone is Italian. I'm going to say he likes making shoes, and that's Hero from Big Hero 6, and he is good at robotics. So I'm assuming that makes him better at making car parts. Okay? So essentially what is going to happen, I'm writing a bunch of equations, but what they're going to represent, as you can see I can't see the pointer. But in the first equation, you see the output of Italy for their car parts equals a number A times the number of labor units that they have to create, for example, car parts. And the same thing for shoes. Whatever coefficient they have multiplied by that. And so we're saying that the coefficient for Italians is 1, and that the coefficients for Italians making car parts is 1, and the coefficient for Italians making shoes is 2. So they're better at making shoes than they are. And the inverse is true for, firms in Japan. Firms in Japan are better at making car parts than they are at shoes, so their coefficients is 2 for car parts and then 1 for shoes. All right? So I just moved those equations a little bit over, and I kept the characters because they're cool. But essentially what we're going to also assume is that, and not really assume because we've put these numbers in and that's the assumption, but that Italians are relatively better at producing shoes than car parts, and you see that by taking the coefficients and the ratios between them. So the 2-to-1 ratio, obviously bigger than the 1-to-2 ratio for Japanese firms as well. So what this means or implies is that prices of shoes are going to be lower relative to car parts in Japan, and prices of car parts is going to be different. Again, it translates to that kind of fraction, and there's more math behind there. But essentially, when trade opens, because of the differences in prices, you're going to get, a free market, an equal price, and that means they're going to move to a relatively a price in between both. That is, splits the distance essentially. Anyways, what this suggests is that Italians are going to specialize in producing shoes, like Rocky, and Hero is going to specialize in making car parts, and they're going to totally do that because it's going to maximize their relative productivities and essentially create the implications of trade. But nothing in that talked about economic sectors, right? So this is a primary, secondary, and tertiary level activity that really defines, how countries pursue pathways to development, for example. Again, primary being extracting natural resources from the ground, earth, et cetera, mining, agriculture, et cetera. Secondary sector activity really having to do with, for example, using those resources, turning them into some other kind of good, right? And why should we care? The graphs are a little wonky, but first, you'll see that they really make up, again, large amounts of quantity, but also the compositions really vary by development status. So it's more clear on the right line, with the dashed lines being for developed countries and the solid lines being for developing countries. But as you can see, for developing countries, they have higher levels of primary sector activity than developed countries, which means it's incredibly more significant for them. And this is also true when you look at it in terms of percentages. Again, the dashed lines, when they get blown up on a projector, you can't really see them. But on the right side, you see it pretty similarly, where the percentage of GDP that developing countries dedicate towards primary sector activity is a lot higher than that developed countries do. So this is from The Incredibles. It's an exterminator. He's doing some mining. Again, not totally but anyways, my point is here, more relevant, is that certain sectors of kind of economic activity are really relevant. For example, for OPEC countries, they have to do a lot more primary sector activity. It's even higher than their secondary sector activity, makes up a huge determinant of them. And for example, they also have geographic specificness in what they produce. Okay, what does this have to do with gravity? Basically, there's a really famous relationship. This is a physics equation. It also holds true in an economics context, where essentially the proxies for mass is GDP, and the distance is the same. And this is one of the strongest relationships in economics that international economists study pretty consistently. It goes in, and it's generally borrowed from physics, and also every international economics theory, like the Ricardian model I showed earlier, tries to pull out this relationship. Essentially, what I wanted to do, one of the reasons that it's really attractive is that if you take the logs of it, you get a very nice linear equation, and it makes it really easy to run linear regressions on them, which is a mathematical tool that people use to run empirical analysis. And that's something that we did. So basically, I combined and cleaned two data sets, one that gave you these GDP numbers and the distance numbers, and then one that told you all the different kind of products between every different pairing of countries from the years 2012 to 2022. They had these in different kind of product codes. I converted them into another kind of code, which essentially allowed me to say these products were primary sector activity, these products were secondary sector activity. And again, they're called primary and processed in the rest of the tables, but processed goods are secondary sector activity, right? And so this is the table that you get. The number to look at here is the 0.23. Because this is in logs, I'm just showing the math. You have to take e to the 0.23 to get what happens if the good is in a primary sector. And you get a number of 1.26, which says that if the trade is in a primary sector, that means there's a 26 relative to processed goods. The real value of bilateral trade increases by 26%. And again, for the amount of quantities that we're studying, this is a really big number and highly statistically significant. And then I wanted to interact this with what happens if we interact both development status, also with their primary sector goods processing, for example. So I've bolded these. So essentially, again, these are dummy variables, which just means they're 1 when they're true. So for example, primary is 1 when it's primary good. When the exporter is a developing country, it's 1. And then when the good is primary and the exports are in a developing context, both 1, that's what happens, right? And you get this number of 1.81, essentially doing the same thing. You add all those up, take e to that, 1.81, and that says the real value of bilateral trade increases by 81% when the trade is in primary goods and a developing country, which shows a special kind of significance for this. Extensions, I've run out of time, but I'm more than happy to discuss these questions too. But thank you so much. Yeah.
Any questions?
Great talk, Faisal. I was actually curious if you could address the first question up there. How should countries strategically consider decisions to internationalize sectors?
I made your job easy. Basically, I think that, again, this GDP composition makes a really big difference for countries in terms of, for example, skill development too, right? Primary sector activity and the narrative that's being told to developing countries is export your primary resources, send those to developed countries. They use those to create manufactured products that are incredibly more marked up and also are related to higher skilled labor, right? What this does is creates an incentives, again, for primary developing countries to specialize in primary sector activity. Doesn't lead to the education outcomes and other kind of outcomes necessarily related. That being said, if primary sector goods, because of their geographical specificness, for example, you're not just going to go ahead and find oil in Hawaii all of a sudden. I don't know if Hawaii has oil compared to Saudi Arabia, right? That gives Saudi Arabia a really strong competitive advantage to export that kind of primary resource that's geographically specific. So you must balance that advantage that you might get by the geographic specificness of your primary resources with also other incentives of economic development that are incredibly relevant to creating a development policy or public policy regarding that kind of stuff.
Time for one more.
Oh, not him.
I can't discriminate. It's my contract.
Oh,
Hey, Faisal.
that's crazy.
So, as your roommate, I've seen you up very, very late at night running all these algorithms and whatnot, and the stress of it. And I was curious, kind of, what the challenges are of like getting this data and working with it, and all the behind the scenes of it.
Yeah, I mean, so one, if you just try to think about it, basically the data set that I have is so there's 6,000 product categories, and it is every single country with every single one of their country pairs. A bunch of these sometimes end up being zero or not necessarily relevant, but it is a pretty complete data set compiled by the United Nations. So every trade partner of the United States, what they export to another country in every category that it does. So you multiply that out by the 192 countries times 6,000, and you get that's for 1 year. And then you multiply that out by the 10 years that it is. So it means that these regressions take sometimes, or conversions take hours or days to complete. So yeah, it was a lot of shenanigans with that kind of stuff. But yeah.
Thank you so much, Faisal.
Yeah.